I'm saying that structure is usually better than nothing. Oh, is that right?
When you have time, because we're not going to stay for the whole presentation, so whenever you.
Change the configuration of the room to have a presentation there.
One more
To
time?
change the presentation, the configuration of the room to have a presentation there. And you walk in the back and more rows, almost like a church.
Yeah.
Busting the infrastructural capacities. I'm trying, yeah. We can always
Yeah, squeeze in there in the front.
I think just if somebody wants to, they can share. That's right.
Oh, well, they usually do pick out regular cards and leave, because then when you leave, there's a line.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because if not, people would sign it. Yeah.
I say it's on around.
Did you?
What do you think?
That's right. She talked about this guy has a book. It's pretty good. Two. It looks like two. I don't even know.
There's still Skype.
What'd you make?
Good problem to have.
It is a good problem. But
No, I mean, I have. This is you, right?
I'm here.
Okay. Oh, I don't need one.
Yeah, okay, that's one more. So, someone consider it.
They can give the talk if they want.
Yeah. Let me try the language. No, it's this thing.
Doing contact point. I would do it. If I read some
Robert.
myself and I read it to YouTube.
Is Robert here? Yes. Does he know where the power switch is?
And it's really
Do you know where the power switch is?
wow. But that's for physics.
That's on.
Oh.
You read to
I almost turned it off. Does this work? No. There we go. Hi, welcome. We are a little crowded here today. Welcome to see everybody. How about this? If you've got an empty seat somewhere near you, raise your hand so some folks can find it who are maybe still standing or would like a seat. We've got several of them here up front. Come on in if you need those. Oh, music. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, sure.
someone's speaking, but I don't think he'll mind. Have to do this again. Yeah. Okay. Whatever you think. Renata, you want to start us off?
Good evening and welcome to everyone.
Good evening.
There you go. Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. We have an overflow crowd, and this is amazing. And I'm very happy for Dawson, and I'm very happy for the social sciences department. I'm Renato Ramirez. I chair the social sciences department here at Del Mar College, and I'm extremely proud of our history department. There are 8 volumes, publications that have been made by our history faculty on a table back here. Before you leave, make sure you take a look at them. And there are some literature concerning the courses that we offer, and some displays about the Mexican-American seminar that is held every summer at the Center for Economic Development right across from Ray High School. Okay. I am extremely pleased to introduce, well, Dawson Barrett. Okay, he's the author of the work that will be discussed tonight, The Defiant Protest Movement in Post-Liberal America. I have a little bit of personal experience in this, okay? My father is a World War II veteran. When he returned back from World War II to Duval County, they organized a political party to fight the PAR machine, the political machine that was in place for much of South Texas. And he ended up testifying against him in federal court. And my brother helped organize the Raza Unida movement out of Kingsville back in the 1960s. And I'm very happy and pleased that Dawson continues the work of elucidating the issue of political protest and activism among people. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.
Good evening. My name is Liz Flores, and I'm also from the Department of Social Sciences and the Mexican American Studies program. And I share with my department chair and my colleagues the gratitude and excitement at seeing such a full house. We really appreciate your attendance and your interest in what we know is going to be a very exciting and fascinating lecture. It's just wonderful to be able to walk the halls in my department and to be able to hear from my esteemed colleagues in the Mexican American Studies program, the MAS Summer Seminar we have each summer. We have had such an interdisciplinary effort, and several of the people who are your faculty and those here tonight have given presentations at the MAS Summer Seminar. The 6th annual MAS Summer Seminar will be held on July 19th and July 20th, so save the date. You'll be hearing more about it. You'll see some information about MAS along with the Department of Social Sciences, and so we welcome you, we thank you, and we know you're going to have a very, very good time this evening. And our thanks to my colleagues and to Dawson for all that he has done with his book and all he is going to provide, the information he will provide to us tonight. Have a good evening, and thank you very much.
Okay, I'm the last introducer, I promise. I will introduce Dawson here in just a moment. I'm Brian Stone. I teach also in the Social Sciences program in history. And just wanted first to thank a few people, the Del Mar College, of course, for sponsoring us, the Mexican American Studies program, Social Sciences Department, DMC TV, which is filming the event, you know, for the 30 people in town who are not actually here this evening. We are thrilled at such a crowd. This is a fantastic turnout. I apologize to those of you who have to stand, but thank you very much for being here. This is, a couple quick announcements. There is food in the back, if you have an opportunity to get to that. For those of you who are here for extra credit, and you don't have to brag about that, there will be a sign-up sheet for you after the event. It will be in the back on the table back here with the books on display. Dawson, of course, also has books on display, and I'm sure he'd be happy to let you know the terms of taking one of those home with you. And he'll be available also for questions and comments and discussion after the event, if you'd like to do that. I'll introduce him here in just a second, and then he'll speak. I'm going to have a couple of questions for him based on my own reading of his book, and then we'll throw it open to you guys. We should have time to take a few questions from the audience as well. Dawson Barrett is an assistant professor of history at Del Mar College, where he has taught since 2013. He earned his PhD and MA at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and BA at Portland State University. His first book, Teenage Rebels, right over there, Successful High School Activists from the Little Rock Nine to the Class of Tomorrow, was published in 2015. Geared toward a young adult audience, the book's illustrated vignettes offer examples of teen protest and activism dating back to the American Revolution. In addition to giving lectures and conducting workshops with high school activists, Dawson offered historical background in cheerleading during this spring's high school walkouts, appearing in the Caller Times, Teen Vogue, and The Atlantic. His latest book, The Defiant Protest Movements in Post-Liberal America, was published by New York University Press in May. The book is a history of politics from above and below over the last 4 decades. It also includes a chapter on punk rock, a nod to Dawson's own history as a teenage rebel, which he has not fully outgrown. He is currently putting the finishing touches on a history of the Peoria, Illinois underground music scene, which he is co-authoring with journalist Jonathan Wright. Thank you, Dawson, for doing this, and welcome.
Good evening. If you're outside and you'd rather sit on the floor, there is space up here. But if you stay by the door, then you can escape whenever you'd like. So some quick thank yous. Thank all of you for being here. And thank you especially to Professors Brian Stone, Liz Flores, and Mark Robbins, the History Department, the Mexican American Studies, and Social Sciences more broadly. If I do a good job tonight, you will think that I put this presentation together this afternoon, but it actually took more than 10 years of my life. So I do hope that you enjoy it. I want to talk to you tonight about protest, a long, proud tradition, more integral to American democracy even than voting. In fact, there has still never been a day in U.S. history when every citizen, let alone every resident, has had the right to vote. Protest, by contrast, is such a fundamental human right that it does not require official approval. Our president, Donald Trump, recently remarked that he did not know why protest was even allowed in the United States. This is a funny thing to say, since protest very often is not allowed. In fact, the very people that Trump is referring to were protesting the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh, and they were actually arrested for it. 200 of them, and there have been several hundred more since, including today. But I also take issue with the president's remarks as a historian, because as far as I can tell, essentially everything positive in U.S. history has resulted, at least in part, from disruptive protest of one kind or another. American independence, the end of slavery, voting rights for women, the end of child labor, the end of legalized racial segregation, rights for people with disabilities, benefits packages for veterans, marriage equality, Social Security, you name it, the list is long. These things were all hard fought. They were demanded. They were not given. 2018 has already seen several major protest waves, from teacher strikes and high school walkouts to the civil disobedience of the New Poor People's Campaign, demonstrations at ICE facilities around the country, and recent strikes by prisoners. Considered together, this movement of movements is actually quite stunning. And the issues involved: human caging, homelessness, the defunding of public schools, global instability, and the dangerous deregulation of U.S. businesses are directly related to one another, and they are not new. In fact, these are all outgrowths of U.S. economic policies that have been championed by both major political parties for much of the last half century. So backing up a half century, the United States in the early 1970s was a country with considerable poverty and a very wealthy elite. It was a country rife with racism, sexism, and anti-queer bigotry, and extreme violence directed toward anyone who attempted to challenge the status quo, whether at Kent State, at Attica, or at Wounded Knee. And yet, with all that said, 1972 was actually the most economically equal year in U.S. history. Unemployment was at an all-time low, and wages were at an all-time high. And the country got to that point largely because of the sacrifices of everyday people. The most successful protest waves of the post-Civil War United States were, of course, those of the 1930s, in which there were thousands of strikes and protests by workers and the unemployed every single year, and those of the 1960s era, a movement of movements that included the Black Civil Rights Movement, the Chicano Movement, women's liberation, the Vietnam Peace Movement, and many, many others. From the 1930s period, and really a half century of labor struggle before it, came the New Deal reforms, things like minimum wage, Social Security, food stamps, union rights, something called the weekend, new rules for Wall Street banks, and an end to child labor, and much more. Thousands of Americans were killed, beaten, and arrested to force these changes. But together, the laws and the programs of this period essentially created the American middle class. But these benefits were reserved almost exclusively for white, Anglo, heterosexual men. As George Lipsitz notes, federal programs financed more than $120 billion in new housing, helping create 11 million new homeowners over the course of 4 decades. But less than 2% of that housing was for non-white Americans. In short, the US government delivered tangible privileges to people with white skin. White privilege, if you will. People of color, women, LGBT folks, and youth were deliberately excluded from these reforms. So it is not surprising that they led so many of the protest movements of the 1950s and 60s. These movements, too, radically reshaped U.S. society. For African Americans, the civil rights movement of the post-World War II period, which also paid for its many victories with countless deaths, beatings, and arrests. This movement won an end to poll taxes and similar racist barriers to voting, an end to segregated schools, buses, and stores, an end to all-white juries, an end to bans on interracial marriage, and an end to racial discrimination in housing, among other things, at least ostensibly. The Mexican-American civil rights movement of the period achieved similar gains on a slightly different timeline. For American women, the feminist activists of the 1960s and 70s won equal treatment in public education, including athletics programs, an end to, quote, marital rape exemptions that allowed men to assault their wives without consequence, the emergence of no-fault divorce, which allowed women to leave abusive men without their permission, access for women to elite universities and occupations, and the creation of more than 1,000 rape crisis centers. The powerful environmental movement of the 60s and 70s, meanwhile, forced the creation of the EPA, the Endangered Species List, and the passage of dozens of laws protecting clean air and water, and on and on and on. This is how we got to the most equal moment in U.S. history in the early 1970s. It was through protest that put pressure on the liberal power structure of the period. Granted, these reforms did not all come to fruition exactly as many people had hoped, but they were concrete policy changes, and again, winning them came at a tremendous cost in lives. These things were demanded, they were not given. But the most economically equal moment in U.S. history is not where my book or this lecture ends. In fact, this is where we're going to start our evening. Because since the mid-1970s, the richest 1% of Americans have more than doubled their share of U.S. wealth to 20%, and their share of U.S. income to 20%, and their share of U.S. wealth to 40%. As the pie itself has also grown, that has meant that elites have something like tripled their money or more. Meanwhile, adjusted for inflation, the average American worker makes less today than in 1968. Okay? We do not live in the liberal era of U.S. history. We live after it in what I call post-liberal America. And we can certainly talk about the 1%, you've probably heard that, the richest 1%, and I'm comfortable with that because indeed these are the people who shape policy. However, to be clear, the top 20% of Americans now hold about 90% of the wealth. Okay? That's a lot of math. I forgive you for not keeping track. But what that means is that 80% of our country is clawing and fighting over the 10% of the wealth that's left. Okay? That should reshape how we think about American society. So how this big change happened is one part of the story I want to tell you. The story of how we have come to live in what many are calling a new Gilded Age. An economy that relies on sweatshop labor in global factories and in U.S. fields, that ravages the environment, and that has added massive profit motives both to war and to incarceration. But thankfully, the book also presents a framework for understanding how defiant everyday people have always pushed back against these policies, why the protests have taken the form they have, and why they have succeeded or failed. There is an element of hope in this message. In effect, I want to talk about the people at the top. We can call them the super rich, or the billionaires, or the banks, or the corporations, or the 1%. Okay, I don't care what you call them. And the people at the bottom, right? The 99%, the people. I'm going to call them movements because they're movements of those people trying to put pressure on the people at the top. Because the clashes between these two groups have mostly shaped the world we live in. Okay, that is what I am getting at. The reforms of the 1930s and 60s moved many millions of Americans from abject poverty to home ownership and middle-class success. For the people at the top, though, these reforms were a series of disasters. They, of course, did not like that they had to share any of the vast wealth created by the U.S. economy. They didn't like that they couldn't employ children in their mines or in their factories. They didn't like that they couldn't pay less than minimum wage, or that workers might have unions, or that housing assistance and food stamps made the poor slightly less desperate. And that's actually not my opinion. They did not hide their opinions about how they felt about this. The reforms of the mid-century cut into their share of the pie, and they knew that, and they decided to do something about it. And they came up with an idea, a wonderful, horrible, awful idea called neoliberalism. Has anybody heard that term before? Okay, like 5 people. Okay. This is their idea, and it's a terrible, terrible word. It's really unhelpful, okay? Because neoliberalism is not new, even though it says neo, and it's not liberal, even though it says liberal. And it's not even conservative. It has actually nothing to do with liberal versus conservative. In fact, today, neoliberalism is the economic philosophy of both Republicans and Democrats. It is bipartisan, and that is a big part of our problem, as we'll see over the next half hour or so. Neoliberalism is a pretty awkward word to work with, but thankfully some smarter people than me have suggested some alternatives. As I write in the book, neoliberalism's Wild West, no-holds-barred vision for society has led some people to label the neoliberal end goal as a sort of cowboy capitalism, right? It's like the Wild West. It's rugged, it's opportunistic, and presumably it's armed. Others have suggested the terms savage capitalism and mafia capitalism, right? Maybe that's the kind of economy we have. And my new favorite, Jurassic Park capitalism, which to me sounds about right. It's dependent upon fossil fuels. There's a strict hierarchy of violence. There are irresponsible actions in pursuit of profit. And in the end, it may end up eating us all. Another contender, casino capitalism, also seems appropriate, as neoliberal policies create an often chaotic series of winners and losers, but the house, the people who make the rules, always get their cut, right? In a casino, people who own the casino don't roll the dice to see if they're going to make a profit. Since the 1970s, neoliberal policies have repurposed the US government as a tool for big business and transferred into private hands the massive public wealth that had accumulated in the mid-century welfare state. As sociologist Loic Wacquant argues, neoliberalism does not actually seek deregulation. Rather, quote, it re-regulates the economy in favor of corporations. So this idea, whether we call it neoliberalism or Jurassic Park capitalism, which is my preference, the idea is to redirect the government and the economy in a way that transfers ever more wealth from the people at the bottom to the people at the top. And there are really 4 major ways to do that. Okay? The first is pretty straightforward, right? Cut taxes, especially for the rich. Right? If the millionaires and the billionaires and the corporations don't have to pay taxes, they automatically are keeping more money. Right? That one makes sense. But this, of course, massively depletes the funds that are available to fund things, right? For government budgets. So the second strategy is to cut services. Right? These are called austerity cuts, if you've heard that term. And you know the drill here, right? We can't afford public parks. We can't afford public schools. We can't afford services for the poor. Okay? This is why college tuition today is much, much higher than it was a generation ago. Importantly, though, austerity cuts are targeted. Not everybody has to tighten their belt. Okay? They specifically target the things that benefit the middle and working classes. There is no move to cut the many, many government services that exclusively benefit the super rich. The third component of neoliberalism is deregulation, and again, it is re-regulation. Okay? Changes to the rules that restrain business in any way, things like environmental rules or workers' rights. Deregulate, get rid of the rules, simple enough. But the fourth part of neoliberalism is more complicated, at least on its surface. This is something called privatization, right? Which sounds like the private sector is doing something good for us all. But importantly, that's not what is happening. Okay? Privatization means taxpayer dollars going directly into the pockets of corporations. Things like for-profit prisons, charter schools, weapons manufacturers. They don't make their money in some free market, right? They are handed taxpayer money, generally with few strings attached. So broadly, if you can keep track of these 4 things, that is neoliberalism in a nutshell. This is the campaign to funnel wealth to the people at the top. And I want to give you some idea of the scale here, just from recent history. So bear with me on the numbers. For starters, the war on terror, which I discuss at some length in the book, has now cost about $5.6 trillion. Okay? That's according to a study from Brown University. That's $5.6 million since September 11th, 2001. And setting aside our personal thoughts about U.S. foreign policy, that is a stunning figure to anyone, right? And it is a literally endless war. And a huge amount of that money went straight into the pockets of U.S. corporations. For the year 2003 alone, Lockheed Martin, which coincidentally makes about $1 million in political contributions every year, Lockheed Martin received $21.9 billion in U.S. defense contracts. Boeing got $17.3 billion, Northrop Grumman got $11 billion, and so on and so forth. Halliburton, whose CEO Dick Cheney had recently become Vice President of the United States, ended up taking home $30 billion in contracts overall. So it adds up, right? War is terrible for civilians, it is terrible for soldiers, but it is great for business. And if you've been following the news, it's about to get even better for business in Afghanistan, okay? So that's $5.6 trillion of US taxpayer money, much of it going into corporate coffers. And that doesn't even attempt to tackle the $21 trillion that Forbes recently reported somehow was spent by the Departments of Defense and Housing and Urban Development between 1998 and 2015 beyond their budgets. I don't know how they did it. I guess they found a credit card. So we'll set that one aside. But we do have to add to 5.6 trillion an estimated 5.1 trillion in tax savings from the Bush and Trump tax cuts. And again, these are largely for people at the top. In fact, the richest 1% of Americans were given more of these tax breaks than the bottom 60% of Americans. And this number leaves out a host of other subsidies at the local and state level, like the estimated $1 billion in tax breaks that are given to Walmart stores nationwide, and the millions and millions of dollars in tax incentives that Gregory Portland is giving to Exxon. But we do need to also add another $29 trillion in loan commitments and bad asset purchases to Wall Street banks after they destroyed the global economy. And that doesn't even count the $500 billion TARP funds. The banks were not only bailed out for destroying people's home lives and their occupations, public funds then helped cover big bonuses for bankers and a lobbying budget to prevent additional regulations. Okay, so I get that that's math soup. Okay, I would never expect you to not know those numbers. Okay, but pretty quickly, we've transferred somewhere between 40 and 60 trillion dollars in public wealth to the rich in the last 20 years. And again, this is not all of it. This is the tip of the iceberg, or perhaps in our case, the tip of the melting polar ice caps. That's one of my good jokes of the night. All right. All right, so this is neoliberalism. This is the scale we're talking about, right? Almost unimaginable. So despite 4 decades of constant rhetoric about free markets and free enterprise and small government, there is no free market here, okay? That is silly nonsense, that is make-believe, that is a myth, that is science fiction, that is a fairy tale that we believe to our peril. But neoliberal capitalism actually has doubled the richest 1% share of US wealth and income since the 1970s. That part is very real. And whether you want to call this theft or you want to call this real liberty, okay, I'm amenable to either one, it's on a massive, massive scale. Remember that to count to 1 trillion, you have to count to 1 million times. Okay, that's how massive this is. So let's go back to the 1970s. Okay? People at the top knew that they wanted more, okay? And they knew that neoliberalism could get there, but they'd been more or less stifled in their attempts to do so for almost a half century. So like all good activists, they figured out that there was strength in numbers, so they formed some organizations. In 1973, they started the Heritage Foundation to brainstorm hundreds of neoliberal laws and policy changes, things that they could implement if they could ever get their people into office. A year earlier, they had formed the Business Roundtable. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Business Roundtable. Two? Three. Good, we have 3 people. The Business Roundtable is a special organization. It has a membership of roughly 200 people. They are the CEOs of the top states. Okay? Let that sink in. The top 200 CEOs are in a club together, pooling their money and their influence. The top oil companies and car companies are in the club, the top banks and insurance companies. They've been working together against us, not competing on some free market. And they've been doing this since the early 1970s, right? Since before I was born. They've spent millions of dollars every year reshaping our society. Tax cuts, austerity cuts, deregulation, and privatization. And none of this sort of sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? Like the CEOs are all in a back room with cigars. They're not, they have a website. It's like businessroundtable.com, right? You can check it out. They're out in the open. Elites also formed a group called the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, a group that literally allows corporations to write laws and then hand them to politicians to get them passed. In recent years, ALEC has made some headlines for allowing for-profit prison companies to write laws that increase prison populations, and for allowing gun manufacturers to write laws that increase gun sales. ALEC, too, has been at this since the 1970s. So the super rich formed all these pro-business organizations. And then they also found common cause with a new wave of socially conservative organizations, groups like Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority or Phyllis Schlafly's Anti-Feminist Eagle Forum. So this is what the 1970s looked like at the top. And then in 1980, the Jurassic Park capitalists found their dinosaur champion, Ronald Reagan. People know about this? You know that was stolen? That slogan. So, a plagiarist, among other things. Reagan's neoliberal contributions included aggressive tax cuts for the rich, cuts to poverty programs, and the transfer of something like $1 trillion in public funds through the largest peacetime military spending in U.S. history just in his first term. But Reagan also engaged in a political strategy that should sound familiar to you. Okay? Many of the reforms of the 1930s and 60s that I mentioned earlier had taken the form of federal laws and federal programs because they had to. Okay? There had to be a federal ban on child labor. Otherwise, factories that wanted to hire kids would just move from states that made it illegal to states that made it legal. Right? And that is literally what happened in the early part of the 20th century. All these textile mills moved from New York to places like Alabama and Texas. Okay? Similarly, the racist Jim Crow laws that relegated African Americans and Mexican Americans to second-class citizenship were largely local laws, right? State laws, county laws, things like that. So overruling them required the federal government to come in and actually enforce the Constitution. That is why the strategies of this period revolved around court cases, things like Brown versus the Board of Education, and civil disobedience. Okay, they were trying to draw federal intervention. But rather than pass hundreds of new laws to undo those laws, Ronald Reagan, on behalf of these neoliberal think tanks, offered a different solution. He put saboteurs in charge of federal agencies. He put the country's biggest polluters in charge of EPA, people like extraction industry lawyer Ann Gorsuch, whose son is now a Supreme Court justice. Reagan put white supremacists in charge of civil rights agencies, and he invited sexists to run women's rights programs. My favorite example is his head of OSHA. Right? OSHA is the federal agency that looks after worker safety. Ronald Reagan appointed a man whose own company had been cited with 48 OSHA violations. Right? Someone, perhaps an expert really, but someone clearly unconcerned with worker safety. And these people, of course, did not enforce the law. Okay? They were appointed not to. They were appointed to handcuff the parts of government that actually help people. Okay? And we've seen this recently as well. So whether you like this or not, it's actually a very brilliant political strategy. And these appointments had their intended impact. On Reagan's watch, the rich predictably got much richer, while the country's homeless population quadrupled. And that is a legacy of the Reagan administration. But, and this really gets to the heart of the book, appointing anti-government leaders to government agencies also fundamentally undercuts American democracy. Okay? It leaves protest movements with even fewer avenues for making change. After all, remember that the daily violence was the price of the New Deal and civil rights legislation. But if you take this personally, would you risk your life to get laws changed if you were certain that they would never be implemented? Of course not. Right? That's a huge ask. So this was a great moment for the people at the top, but from the perspective of the people at the bottom, it was truly a hopeless situation. But as in all such situations throughout our history, people found ways to push back. They found ways to fight for the world that they wanted to live in. Many of the activists of the 1980s decided to focus their efforts locally. Food Not Bombs, for example, fed hungry people, not by changing the laws, but by going to get food and giving it to people. Right? In Corpus, our group is Tacos Not Bombs. Okay, same idea. The Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, which was on a TV show called Whale Wars for a while, used its ships to ram illegal whaling vessels on the open seas. The sanctuary movement of the period helped protect refugees of Reagan's bloody interventions in Central and South America. The group ACT UP responded to Reagan's inaction on the AIDS crisis. Punk rock and hip hop are in there too, but that's sort of another story. And the environmentalists of a group called Earth First, a group that I examined quite a lot in the book, engaged in civil disobedience to protect the clear-cutting of ancient forests and to protect endangered wildlife. In effect, Earth First activists put their body on the line to do the work that should have been done by the EPA. In Arizona, Earth Firsters chained themselves to logging equipment, they climbed up into trees, and they protested while wearing animal costumes in order to prevent development in a nearby mountain range. They were arrested, they were beaten up, they were threatened, they were humiliated, they were infiltrated by the FBI, but they were actually able to stall their opponents for more than a decade. However, unlike the sit-ins of the 1960s, which again were aimed at drawing intervention from the federal government, Earth First civil disobedience had to be an end in itself. They were on their own. And in the end, this group lost. Political context is vital to the victories of social movements. During the 1930s and 60s periods, activists were beaten and killed for their actions, but they also won some major victories, and it was because the people in power were vulnerable. It was not because the protests got bigger or better. Okay? Civil rights activists and striking workers had been doing essentially the same thing for a half century. The change was that the Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War political contexts made the powerful slightly more vulnerable. So back to the 80s of Ronald Reagan, the environmental movement needed that direct action, the disruptions to protect the forests, but it also needed an electoral strategy to elect progressive, environmentally conscious Democrats. Instead, they lost on the national stage, and the Democrats too became neoliberals, leaving big business with two parties and the people with none. Elections matter. For movements, elections decide who they will later try to pressure and who they will protest. And historically speaking, you want that to be someone who doesn't fire up their base by brutalizing you. It also turns out that there's no such thing as local. Right? Maybe you've seen that bumper sticker, think global, act local. There's no such thing as a local level, at least not in a way that exempts you from the levels above it. For example, just a few years ago, you might have heard about this, the people of Denton, Texas, where North Texas is, they voted to ban fracking in city limits after carcinogens were found on a playground near a fracking well. The people of Denton decided that they didn't want their children to get cancer. And so they passed a referendum. They voted on it, and they decided there'd be no fracking in the city limits of Denton. But then the Texas legislature, whose members coincidentally get large contributions from oil companies, decided that local bans on fracking would not be allowed. Similarly, the Earth First activists of the 1980s sustained beatings and arrests in the remote mountains of Arizona, and they were ultimately defeated not by their city council or their sheriff or a local business. They weren't even defeated by the anti-environmentalists of the Reagan administration. They were defeated by President Bill Clinton. And you can read about the details about this in the book if you'd like. But in the 1990s, neoliberalism became bipartisan. Clinton, of course a Democrat, deregulated Wall Street, deregulated the media, slashed poverty assistance, and aggressively expanded mass incarceration through his crime bill. The US now has the largest prison population on the planet, more than 2 million people. and for-profit prisons are a many billion-dollar industry. Money for caging people, of course, but also profits from factories that move behind prison bars and don't have to pay minimum wage. Clinton also deregulated international capital through so-called free trade initiatives, things like NAFTA and the World Trade Organization. These are getting a lot of interest right now, but unsurprisingly, these programs were backed by the Business Roundtable, as well as other industry organizations. And free trade helped corporations boost their profits in major ways by moving manufacturing from union-strong parts of the country, places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, to the sweatshops of the global South. Factories where workers are poorly paid, where there are few safety or environmental regulations, and where union organizing invites beatings or death. Meanwhile, Walmart became the leading employer back in the United States, paying its average worker less than $20,000 a year. Just as Reagan's federal appointments had created roadblocks for the activists of the 1980s, the expansion of economic supply chains to this global level forced activists to pursue new strategies. In this case, they actually had to think about the entire planet all at the same time, which is not easy to do. But I talk about it more in the book, so buy it. It's hard enough to impact your own city hall, right? How do you affect working conditions on the other side of the planet, right? Once again, the problem seems impossible, but those who wanted to tackle it found ways to do so. That is the hopeful thread that we can follow here. One idea that gained momentum in the 1990s was to confront global economic elites whenever they came out in public. That's sort of the equivalent of kicking people out of restaurants. Okay? In 1999, for example, environmental activists, labor unions, anti-sweatshop activists, indigenous rights activists, and others famously shut down every intersection in downtown Seattle in order to prevent the World Trade Organization from meeting. And it worked. The WTO canceled their meeting. Similar protests greeted subsequent meetings of global elites all over the world, leading them to retreat to increasingly repressive host countries. And if NAFTA and the WTO sound boring to you, I sympathize. But consider this. Each includes a mechanism through which corporations can appeal city, state, and federal laws that they don't like. And they make these appeals completely in secret without your input. And if they win, they don't have to follow the law. Of the appeals that we know about that have been leaked, the WTO has ruled 100% of the time in favor of corporations and 0% of the time in favor of democracy. So while Reagan and his team deregulated nationally through their appointments, the Clinton team deregulated internationally through trade agreements, and they did so with bipartisan support. And deregulation in this case means costing people their lives and their livelihoods. So I think we can actually add that we are a nation of laws to our fairy tale about the free market. In addition to massive protests against the WTO and their ilk, global justice activist groups like Sweatshop Watch and a wave of workers' centers like Voces de la Frontera in Wisconsin and the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida also tried to figure out how to fight for the rights of workers across the global supply chain. One of my favorite groups is a group of college students and high school students, United Students Against Sweatshops, who wondered how they could impact factory conditions in places like Honduras or China and Indonesia. And the answer, it turns out, is that neither Nike nor factory owners in Indonesia care at all about what college students think, say, or do. They don't care. However, Nike has to care what universities with big athletics programs have to say because multi-million-dollar contracts are on the line. So to impact foreign factories, students acted at their own schools. They occupied administration buildings, they picketed basketball and football games, and ultimately they threatened to associate iconic athletic programs like UT, Texas A&M, or Baylor with child labor and sexual violence in foreign sweatshops. And students were, of course, harassed and arrested and often suspended, but a surprising number of university administrators responded by calling up Nike. and some changes were made. But the global economy that we all live in is still a race to the bottom. And the refugee crises in Western Europe and in the United States have to be understood as desperate people fleeing failing economies, repressive governments, and war zones that have been shaped in many ways by the policies of the United States government and by US corporations. Consider, for example, the fact that after signing NAFTA into law, effectively saying that there is no US-Mexico border if you are an avocado or if you are a tomato or a shoe, the United States actually tripled its immigration agency budget and doubled the number of Border Patrol agents in less than a decade. Okay? And it's actually much, much bigger now. So free trade means there is no border for corporate dollars, but a border with guns for human beings. Trump's proposed border wall will certainly funnel billions of dollars to whatever companies get to build it, but the US-Mexico border, as we know, is already fortified, in part to trap people in the factories and the fields that so cheaply produce our consumer goods. Also, when we talk about the pros and the cons of global capitalism today, we need to include that this economy runs on the labor of as many as 45 million enslaved people, many of them in countries whose names appear regularly on our t-shirts and on our shoes. In fact, there are an estimated 60,000 enslaved people in the United States right now, and every single person in this room has eaten food picked by their hands. So when we hear terms like free market and free trade, we have to continue to question for whom they are free. The next wave of change at the top, and I promise we're almost done here, was of course the Bush administration's war on terror, which was and is different things to different people based on your experience. Many of my students, of course, are veterans who served in Iraq or Afghanistan or elsewhere, but many are actually too young to even remember 9/11, and many have never heard of the horrible Abu Ghraib torture scandal. Okay, this is how long we've been in Afghanistan, 17 plus years. So one aspect of this infinite war is that $5.6 trillion price tag that I mentioned. And to be clear, Bush's wars were a little different than previously. They were privatized on a bold new level. For example, in 2008, there were 152,000 US troops in Iraq and 156,000 private contractors. Okay, so more than half of our forces there weren't actually US soldiers, they were corporate employees. The occupation also forced neoliberalism onto the Iraqi people at gunpoint. Far from the freedom and democracy of Bush administration rhetoric, the United States, by decree, lowered Iraq's corporate taxes, privatized publicly held mines and factories, allowed Iraqi banks to be sold to foreign investors, eliminated tariffs and taxes on imports and exports, and free trade, and made US soldiers and contractors immune from Iraqi law. As an extension of globalization, the war on terror also required activists to consider how they could act locally and impact things on the other side of the world. And there were massive, massive protests. Even before the US invasion of Iraq in February of 2003, something like 12 million people in 300 cities in 60 countries hit the streets to oppose the war. These are some of the largest protests in the history of humankind. But peace activists, including veterans, were greeted with death threats and accusations of being un-American traitors and being terrorist sympathizers. And this is basically impossible terrain for making political change. The US's ongoing war on terror is estimated to have caused between 1 and 2 million civilian deaths, and to have displaced as many as 10 million people from their homes. And that's in addition to 7,000 US soldiers killed and about as many US contractors killed, as well as nearly 1 million US veterans who suffer from disabilities. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld had promised that the war in Iraq would last 5 months or less, and that it would cost less than $50 billion. But those were not the only lies that launched that war. As movement philosopher Rebecca Solnit argues, the The Iraq War peace movement almost certainly accomplished a less horrible war than would have been otherwise, but who can celebrate a victory with such a terrible reckoning? At the close of Bush's presidency, the Great Recession hit, but instead of helping the victims of the banks and their recklessness, politicians of both parties used the recession as an excuse to double down on the very neoliberal policies that had caused it, by cutting funding for education, eliminating workers' rights, privatizing public schools, highways, and parking enforcement, and deregulating the oil, gun, and high-interest loan industries. Rather than hold the people who caused the crisis accountable, those in power instead blamed those with essentially no impact on economic policy: immigrants, school teachers, and American Muslims, among others. At the federal level, President Barack Obama largely maintained the status quo, attempting to stabilize the neoliberal order by reeling in some of its excesses. He scaled back Bush's military occupations, but he oversaw a no less aggressive foreign policy, rooted in drone attacks and assassinations, covert operations in more than 100 different countries, and the continued use of private contractors. Obama also notably deported more people than any of his predecessors, but this was perfectly in line with the post-NAFTA policies of both Clinton and Bush. His education policy, like No Child Left Behind that he inherited, favored privatization. Like every U.S. administration since 1980, Obama's was firmly rooted in neoliberalism. Despite much nonsense about Obama being a socialist, Wall Street banks were actually among his campaign's largest donors, and an estimated 94.8% of the income growth during his first term went to the richest 1% of Americans. Believe it or not, the Koch brothers, if you know who they are, they're famous billionaires. The Koch brothers had a hand in ALEC and the Business Roundtable. The Koch brothers' net worth actually doubled under Obama. So I don't know what they're so mad about, actually. Okay. The Obama era also saw an explosion of protest movements: Occupy Wall Street, opposition to the Keystone XL pipeline, Black Lives Matter, anti-deportation protests, and Standing Rock, among others. People may not remember, but before it was violently crushed, Occupy Wall Street actually exploded. A month in, there were protests and encampments in 950 cities in more than 80 countries. It was large. And despite a popular narrative that Occupy activists didn't know what they wanted, the movement actually targeted neoliberalism in very clear terms. In fact, Frank Luntz, the well-known Republican strategist, made that clear. In December of 2011, he addressed the Republican Governors Association, and he told them he was, quote, frightened to death by Occupy. And he advised them to stop using the tainted term capitalism and instead talk about economic freedom. Instead of raising taxes on the rich, an idea that was becoming more and more popular, he told them to describe taxes as, quote, government taking money from hardworking Americans. President Obama was only nominally sympathetic to protest movements, and he helped crush Occupy Wall Street. However, under pressure from activists, he did make good on marriage equality and basic rights for transgender school kids. In response to Black Lives Matter, his administration launched investigations of the Chicago and Ferguson, Missouri police departments that revealed rampant, open racism. Obama also temporarily halted the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines. These were important movement victories, if small. Our current president, at least for now, is without a doubt one of the crassest public figures in recent memory. I don't think it's controversial to point out that he is controversial. Okay? But however you may feel about him, support him or not, Donald Trump's approach to education, war, fossil fuels, and immigration are accelerations of Obama policies. They are not departures. Trump has clear authoritarian and white nationalist impulses, but beyond his Twitter feed, his policies are neoliberal. He boasts about deregulation for its own sake. He signed a massive tax handout for the rich. He has appointed saboteurs to federal agencies, notably including climate change deniers to head the EPA. He's moved to further private privatize public education and is making similar overtures concerning veterans' affairs. His ideas for a border wall and a space force will certainly direct taxpayer dollars to corporations. And frankly, Trump has really privatized the presidency itself, right? Funneling public money to his own resorts and hotels. Right? So that's kind of the ultimate neoliberal. To be clear, understanding neoliberalism, okay, all these things I've been talking about, is not going to allow any of us to wrap up our society in a nice, neat package with a bow. Okay? Ours is a very messy history, a complex combination of not just economic inequality, but also white supremacy and male supremacy. And there are constant contradictions. However, I do think that this narrative of neoliberalism helps explain some important recent events that otherwise don't really make sense. Consider, for example, the standoff at the Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota that reached its peak in 2016. It's okay if you don't remember or know the details here, but this conflict featured on one side Native Americans and sort of a hodgepodge of activist friends, including a couple thousand US military veterans. So Native Americans on one side, and on the other side, an oil pipeline company whose investors included some of the most powerful people in America: Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, a guy named Donald Trump, as well as police from at least 75 agencies from 10 different states. How else can we make sense of this? Just last month, thousands of people marched through the streets of San Francisco to protest fossil fuels. Literally, they were demanding regulation. In our country, perhaps especially in our state, we are overly tolerant to absolute nonsense when it comes to science. Climate change is real. It is happening, and it is because of us. And it is much worse than you think, no matter how bad you think it is. It is costing people their lives. The hottest 3 years on Earth in more than a century were 2015, 2016, and 2017. I wonder what those years have in common. Current levels of carbon dioxide are higher than they have been in 800,000 years. And in the next 3 generations of human history, so whatever, your great-grandchildren, 75% of the animal species on Earth today are expected to be made extinct. 75%. We are at a crossroads in human history, and the survival of our very species is in jeopardy. But I don't expect you to believe in me. Who am I? Right? I'm just some guy who's giving you extra credit to be here. And it also turns out that I can't predict the future. Right? Nobody can predict the future, but I can tell you about the past. This is an advantage of being a historian. ExxonMobil, you might have heard of them, they're the largest US oil company, one of the largest companies on Earth, has known about climate change since at least the 1970s, maybe earlier. But Exxon has also spent millions upon millions of dollars since then to convince people like you and me that climate change does not exist and we shouldn't try to do anything about it. Now, can anyone think of any reason why Exxon would not want us to try to address climate change? I can think of one. And it makes me wonder if we should take their word about what their new plant across the bay will or will not do for air and water quality. According to a Drexel University study, climate change denial organizations boast an annual budget of more than $900 million. Okay? So they spend $1 billion a year to convince us to ignore that our fossil fuel addiction is jeopardizing our very survival. And these organizations are mostly financed by energy companies. The Koch brothers, who I mentioned earlier, who are known around here as Flint Hills Resources, the Koch brothers on their own spent $25 million to stop climate change legislation just between the years 2005 and 2008. Okay? They're throwing a lot of money at it. They also sent climate change denial information packets to high school science teachers all across the United States in hopes of convincing young people not to worry about the world that they will have to live in. But if you've been following the news this week, even the Trump administration now acknowledges climate change. Despite repeatedly denying it and calling it a liberal hoax, perhaps even a Chinese hoax, now the administration believes in climate change and believes that we cannot prevent temperature rises of 7 degrees by the end of the century. So their response is that we should not even try to curb greenhouse gases because we're already doomed. So we need deregulation because there is no problem, but we also need deregulation because the problem is inevitable. But listen to me tonight, if we don't do something, we really will be doomed, because you cannot imagine a world that is 7 degrees hotter. Okay? And if anyone can right this ship, I have to believe it's young people. This spring, youth in this country picked a fight. They picked a fight with the gun industry, which, like the fossil fuel industry, is a major player in electoral politics, and which derives considerable profit from government contracts, actually. These protests, if you've been following them, are generally framed in one of two ways. Right? Supporters talk about student safety, right? Student rights. Students should be able to sit in classroom without being scared. Okay? Their opponents talk about their unwavering support for the Second Amendment without compromise. Okay? Those are two positions, but this issue also has to be understood as a fundamental debate about the rights of corporations. In this case, it's the right of arms manufacturers to profit without restriction or accountability for the impacts of their products. Unsurprisingly, gun industry-backed politicians have largely limited their solutions to proposals that will allow the industry to sell the most guns and make the most money. Right? We can't get rid of guns, let's just have more guns. Okay? Essentially, more privatization and more deregulation. To hell with kids' lives. Meanwhile, the school teachers of West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and now Washington, teachers who often have to get second and third jobs just to pay their mortgages, are themselves trying to buck a half-century of public education cuts. And yet, for-profit education is something like $1 trillion industry now. In fact, we spend $2 billion of public money every year just for standardized tests. Okay? Every year. In other words, we do have the money. Right? We absolutely can afford things like quality public education, or healthcare, or renewable energy infrastructure. Okay? We can, we just choose not to. Okay? We keep giving tax money, perhaps to the wrong people. Okay? Also, hitting close to home, the cruelty with which the Trump administration has approached asylum seekers on our border should be condemned in the harshest possible language, in my opinion. Right? Children are being caged in our state on our watch. But there is also a lot of money to be made terrorizing migrants and would-be migrants. Honestly, this ship is being steered by companies that make their money from the taxpayers through private prisons and immigrant detention centers. To give you some idea of the ballpark here, the GEO Group made $2.6 billion last year. Core Civic, which used to be called Corrections Corporation of America, made almost $2 billion. And Southwest Key, in addition to siphoning public education dollars through charter schools, including one in Corpus, has taken in about $1 billion since 2015 to keep immigrant children behind bars. On its own, caging children in the United States is now a $1 billion industry. So the point is really this, right? Many of the crises that we face in our current moment are the same crisis. Okay? And unfortunately, voting alone cannot fix it. The two parties are not the same, okay? But their overlap is on what is creating these problems. Because both parties embrace neoliberalism, neither is going to provide humane immigration policy. That is not on the table. Neither party is going to fund public education. Neither party is going to curtail spending on the military apparatus. Neither party is going to address climate change. And neither party rejects Goldman Sachs. At least not right now, right? Not unless we make them. Elections matter. Please, please vote. Vote, 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 vote. Okay? Vote for people you like if you can find them. If you don't, vote against the people who you think are the worst. Right? That should be easier. But it's going to take a lot more than voting from all of us. Right? Voting is easy. Democracy is hard. We carry a very great burden. But there's some good news. If our crises are related, then Standing Rock, the teacher strikes, the high school students, the immigrant rights movement, the environmental movement, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, the Women's March, and Me Too is all one big movement. And you can plug in wherever you feel the most at home, because we have work to do. I don't have an easy answer for you on how we do this, because it's not going to be easy. But the people in this book, the people in this lecture, at least give us somewhere to start. And if this all sounds incredibly hopeless to you, then you've actually been listening tonight. The odds are against us. But if you join this fight on the side of those working for a more just and humane world, despite impossible odds, you're following in the footsteps of some of the real heroes of U.S. history, the abolitionists, the rabble-rousers, and other troublemakers who fought this same fight also against impossible odds long before we got here. So my hope is that this history, right, the history in this book and in this lecture and the history that I teach, will somehow help you and help me and help us shape the future. Okay? As I write, quote, "This is a book about a fight, and it is not a fair one. But fair or not, this is the fight of our lives." Thank you for your time. I guess now is your opportunity to ask questions or throw tomatoes or sneak out.
The sign-up sheet will be in the back.
The sign-up sheet will be in the back.
What year did you move to South Texas?
What year did I move to South Texas? I am in my 6th year here.
6 year. In 1995 or so, South Texas Hispanics boycotted against Pepsi and Gatorade due to Howard Stern. I didn't know if you were familiar with that.
I don't know that story.
Yeah, that's it was in the Color Times. They showed the empty shelves where the employees were not even going to put it on the shelf. They weren't even going to touch the merchandise, and it made a big impact to California, Florida, and Texas.
Awesome. Yeah, there's actually a very rich local history here. Talk more about that if you want.
Well, no, just wanted if
Yeah,
you
no,
knew
that's-
that or
yeah,
not,
that's-
because
I
I know
didn't know
you're
that.
into
Yeah,
that, and that's
I
part
am
of
into
Corpus
that.
Christi
Yeah.
history.
I appreciate that. Any other questions?
I just came.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
I came for fun.
So it's something that's been brought up, how come it's not more publicly known? Like, why is it that I'm finding out a lot of the information through a history class?
Well, there's a very deep, long answer to that. Right? Why haven't I heard about this before? There are a lot of things that have to do with who doesn't want you to know about it that we could talk about. But to be real clear, this is what's sort of wonderful about writing this book and giving lectures like this. For many people, like their jaws drop and they say, "Whoa, I've never heard this before. This is wild." But if this was a room full of professional historians, which some of it is, they say, "There's nothing there. You're not even giving us any new information." Right? So there's such a gap between what is taken for granted by people who study this and by sort of the general public. And I think there are a bunch of reasons for that. I guess one is not enough people have bought my book yet. But again, what I want to make clear is that this isn't a conspiracy, right? I mean, these groups that I talk about, they have web pages where they tell you, like, this is what we do, right? So I don't want the next step to be like, everyone's out to get us, right? Actually, this is public information. Now you have heard it. Now you have to ask your friends why they haven't heard it.
But what I want to know is, like, okay, so for example, say 10 people on this, you're saying 1%. So out of 10 people, only one person, or let's say 100 people, only one person is out to get us. So how come the other 99 people aren't together to get it for themselves? Or is it,
Yeah.
do Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. To be clear, I don't think that they're out to get us necessarily. I think they're out to make more money, and that might come at our expense. I think that actually one of the things that I did mention might help explain it, as this long line has to go through. So what I said was that the top 20% of Americans own 90% of the wealth, right? 90% of everything, and so that leaves 80% clawing over the remaining 10%. So it really makes sense that the people at the bottom would be suspicious of each other and be fighting each other because they're in a really horrible, impossible situation, right? And meanwhile, money at the top is just doubling and doubling and doubling. There are books, many books written just on that question. I wish I knew.
The government spending in, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a hand.
I thought
I'm a
you looked
teacher, so
away.
hands get, yeah.
So, if Republicans are neoliberalists and Democrats are neoliberalists, then who do we vote for?
I think that I can't tell you who to vote for. Again, I think you have to vote for who you think is the least bad. But we also are going to have to force, people in those parties to change. Right? That's sort of what happened, 80 years ago, is that there was a party that didn't actually care about workers' rights, and then workers made them care. We see some of this happening right now, right? There's obviously a fight within the Democratic Party. There's sort of like the Bernie Sanders people, and this is not an endorsement of Bernie Sanders, but it's sort of hilarious that people call him a socialist because his policies are like 1950s Republican, right? All he is a liberal, like in an actual definition of what liberal means. But we're so far removed from that we're like, whoa, he wants doctors for people, what the, right? So, and like the tax rates, like the tax rates for the top people were like 90% in the 50s, right? Now, I don't know, 40% or something. So, I also am not, I don't have the solution for the future. If I did, I'd be leading the charge right now. But I'm just trying to inform us. Maybe you know better than I do on that. But yeah, I'm also legally prohibited from endorsing candidates.
Oh, no, I just was going to say that the government spending in the 80s really did impact South Texas because there was a lot of layoffs from private corporations due to different things like hurricane in South Texas that just destroyed a lot of Baker Marine and the Ingleside area back in the 70s. So when the 80s budgets for the defense came up, South Texas was able to get the Army Depot, and then that's one of the biggest employers in South Texas now.
Right, and that's
Is that in part of
public, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
would you say that Bernie Sanders is a non-neoliberal?
Yes, yeah, his policies are liberal, like what liberal meant 50 years ago. Yes, he is not a neoliberal. He believes in government-run, accountable public programs. But he's not trying to get rid of capitalism. So he's not actually a socialist, but whatever. But yes, and again, so that's the rift within the Democratic Party, is that we have sort of like the neoliberal and the liberal wings. But we throw around the word liberal like neoliberals are liberal, and they're not. Right? I know that's super confusing. It bums me out too. Let's just say Jurassic Park capitalism from now on, right? But yeah, I would make a pretty clear argument.
So,
Yeah.
throughout history, would you say it's typical of a big corporation to take advantage of protests in general, kind of like how Nike right now seems to be doing with Kaepernick?
Yeah, so the question is it common for corporations to sort of take advantage of like movement, I don't know, popularity? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Okay. No, it's usually common for them to steer clear of it. The thing about Nike